Support staff don't save lives. That's what he said. Right to my face, swirling his scotch like he was stating a universal law of physics. And the worst part? Everyone around the table laughed like it was just another harmless joke. My name is Sergeant Rachel Hill. I've served 12 years in military intelligence, specifically in ISR intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. I don't carry a rifle. I sit in a shipping container 4,000 miles away from the battlefield, surrounded by screens, heat signatures, and encrypted audio feeds. I wasn't out there kicking down doors, but I was the one whispering in their ears, telling them which doors were rigged to blow. People like me rarely get a story told. We don't wear medals in public. We don't get our names carved on plaques. And we sure as hell don't get standing ovations at the post bar. We are the ghosts in the machine. But the funny thing about being invisible is that people forget you're listening. They forget you're the one holding the map. They forget that while they are the ones pulling the trigger, you are the one deciding where to aim. I've learned to live in that space between what people assume and what they'll never know unless I tell them. So today, I will. Not for revenge, not for attention, just because some truths don't stay buried forever. That night, when Captain Mark Davis mocked me like my work never mattered, I could have walked away. I almost did. But there comes a moment when silence stops being strength and starts becoming permission, and I don't give that kind of permission anymore. The first thing I noticed pulling up to Fort Elridge was how nothing had really changed. Same checkpoint. Same barbed wire fences curling like frozen vines. Same cold wind whipping off the mountains to slap the back of your neck like it knew you didn't belong. I hadn't been there in 3 years. Not since my final assignment wrapped and they handed me a commendation I never displayed. But now I was back. Not for duty, but for Davis's wedding. Captain Mark Davis, the hero of Blackout Ridge. The man everyone still toasted to at Friday night gatherings, like his story had built the base brick by brick. The officers' club was decked out in muted greens and crisp whites, trying hard to look soft in a place that wasn't meant for softness. Faces I hadn't seen in years lit up as they recognized each other, hugs exchanged, voices raised with memories from deployment zones most people wouldn't dare name. And then they saw me. Smiles faltered for half a second before they settled into polite recognition. "Rachel, still working tech, right?" someone said, as if that summed up a decade of analyzing kill zones. Another chimed in. "Hey, good to see you. Can you fix the Wi-Fi in the lobby? It's spotty." They laughed. I smiled. It was easier than explaining that the last system I fixed was a compromised drone feed that tracked a high-value target across 3 borders. No one asked where I'd been stationed last. No one asked what I'd done since the Ridge. They just looked past me, eyes scanning for the real star of the weekend. Davis was surrounded, of course. Men in decorated dress blues clapped his back, and women clung to every word he tossed out like candy. He had that easy way of owning a room, the charisma of a man who has never had to question his own worth. I stood near the coffee table, half smiling at a conversation I wasn't part of, clutching a lukewarm cup that gave my hands something to do. Every corner of Fort Elridge had echoes for me. The operations tent, where I first learned to override drone protocol in the middle of a blackout. The comms building, where I once pulled a 38-hour shift coordinating evac routes during a flood op, but nobody remembered those moments. Because I didn't have mud on my boots, my stories didn't survive in their minds. They remembered Davis charging through fire. They remembered the body count, the near death, the miraculous escape. They didn't remember the voice in his ear telling him when to turn, when to run, when not to freeze. And why would they? That voice didn't have a face. It didn't bleed. It didn't look good in a wedding photo. I told myself I came for closure, maybe even to reconnect, but standing in that room, invisible in plain sight, I realized I hadn't come to be included. I'd come to see how much they'd forgotten, and it turns out, they'd forgotten just enough to make space for a fairy tale. one where Davis was the only reason anyone got out alive. It started like it always did. The dinner was winding down, the wine was flowing, and the stories were getting louder. Someone clinked their glass and leaned toward Davis with that familiar grin. "Come on, Cap, tell them about Blackout Ridge." The room shifted instantly. Conversations died down. Heads turned. Even the background music seemed to fade into irrelevance. Davis sat up straighter, like a performer hitting his mark. He gave a modest shrug, the kind meant to invite more begging. Then he launched in, voice smooth and confident, painting the scene with a mix of grit and heroism. "Third Recon. Midnight Op," Davis began. "Everything went dark. No GPS, no satellite, comms jammed. We were blind, outnumbered, deep in enemy terrain." He paused for effect. Someone at the table actually gasped. "Smoke thick as tar," he continued. "Heat flaring up like the whole hill was breathing fire. One wrong step, and we'd be toast. But I kept us moving." He described how he found an opening in the ridge, how he calculated the shift in wind, how he led 6 men through collapsing ground and boiling air. The words rolled out like a rehearsed speech, sharpened by time and applause. He was the only one talking, but everyone else filled in the awe for him. I watched as he detailed his decision to ignore flawed intel and trust his gut. "We had some voice on the emergency comms," he said with a dramatic smirk, static-filled, garbled, telling us to hold position. "But I knew better. If we had held position, we would have been mortar bait." He took a sip of his drink. "So I made the call. I moved us out. Instinct. That's what saves you when the tech fails." Activideo. Laughter broke out. Someone raised a glass to the real MVP. Davis grinned like the moment had always belonged to him. In that room, he was a war hero, a legend retelling his survival, and no one questioned it. Halfway through his story, I stopped hearing his voice and started hearing my own memory. Every detail he described: the layout of the ridge, the heat bloom, the moment they turned left instead of right, matched exactly what I had seen from the control room. I had been the one watching their thermal signatures flicker on a failing satellite feed. I was the one marking danger zones in real time. He spoke about finding the path, but I remembered flagging that route after spotting a secondary thermal spike that indicated an ambush ahead. He described ignoring intel, but it was my voice, steady and clear through the distorted comms, that told them where to go. And now, sitting across the room, he was stringing my choices into a story that didn't include me. Davis leaned back in his chair, swirling the last of his drink, and said it like he was revealing some great mystery. "You know, people ask me about that voice on the radio," he said. "The one that tried to give us coordinates." He chuckled. "It had to be some guy back at base. Deep voice, calm. Probably some grizzled old operator who'd seen hell and come back twice. Only a guy like that stays calm when the world is burning." He looked around the table, making eye contact. "Definitely not a woman," he added, grinning. "No offense, ladies, but biology is biology. When the pressure hits red, a female voice pitches up. It gets shaky. You can't hide panic. And in a firefight, panic kills." The room nodded along as if he'd just quoted a law of physics. A few people laughed, not mean-spirited, just comfortable, like they were all in on the same truth. Even his fiancée grinned, resting her head on his shoulder. I stayed quiet. My fingers traced the rim of my glass. It wasn't enough that I was invisible in the version he told. I also had to be impossible. I couldn't have been the voice that saved them because, by his logic, I didn't have the biology for bravery. I didn't have the tone for command. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so familiar. This wasn't new. This was just a louder version of every time someone called me tech support. Just as the dessert plates were being cleared, Davis stood up. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in black cloth. He unwrapped it and held it out in his palm. A warped chunk of metal, blackened at the edges, with tiny wires still fused to its frame. A piece of a broken propeller. "This," he said, his voice low and reverent, was all that was left of our recon drone. It went down seconds before we made it out. I keep it to remind myself that technology fails. Machines break. Only men survive. My stomach tightened. That wasn't just a drone. That was Viper 26. That was my drone. I had been the one steering it. I had guided it between rock formations and heat flares, pushing it farther than its specs were built for, just to get them one more look at the ridge. I had redlined the engines to distract the enemy fire away from his squad. I had watched that metal fragment plummet through pixelated static the moment I'd shouted for them to turn. I crashed it on purpose, to create a diversion. Davis traced its surface with his thumb. He was using my sacrifice as a prop for his ego. People passed it around, murmuring admiration. I watched it come back to him. Then it happened. One of the bridesmaids, tipsy and curious, turned to me. "Rachel, you work with drones and stuff, right?" she asked. "Have you ever actually saved anyone? Or do you just watch?" The table froze for a second. Davis chuckled louder than the rest. "She's support staff, honey," Davis said, looking at me with pity. "Support staff don't save lives. They file reports about the lives we save." He looked me in the eye. "No offense, Rachel. But you tech types, you sit in air conditioning. You don't know what it's like when your heart rate hits 180 and you can't feel your hands. That's why you stay behind the glass. It's safer for everyone." No one stopped him. His tone wasn't mean, just confident. Inside, something folded in on itself. I wasn't angry. Not yet. It was something quieter. Pressure is building behind my ribs. The weight of too many moments like this. They didn't see the control room. They didn't see the sweat between my shoulder blades as I rerouted 3 squads through fire, whispering calm into their comms while the feed stuttered. They didn't want to see it. Because if they saw it, they'd have to let go of the story where only the ones out front mattered. I set my glass down slowly. The sound of it hitting the table was barely more than a click, but the room quieted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Unit Bravo, shift left now." The words left my mouth with the same tone I'd used that night. Low, flat, metallic, the voice of God in the ear of a desperate man. Heat surge incoming at 12 o'clock. Ceiling instability detected. 3 seconds to collapse. "Move!" Davis froze. His wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He stared at me. His brow furrowed. He looked like someone trying to remember a dream that was turning into a nightmare. "What did you say?" he whispered. The table went silent. "You heard me, Captain," I said. My voice still perfectly even. Davis laughed, but it was a nervous, jagged sound. You read the after-action report. You memorized the transcripts? That's creepy, Rachel." He looked around the table for support. "She's quoting the mission logs." I shook my head slowly. "The mission logs don't have the audio transcript, Mark. The comms were jammed. Remember?" Davis blinked. He knew that was true. The official record only had the GPS data. Then how? He started, then stopped. He crossed his arms. "You're guessing. You heard me tell the story. It's number 5. I didn't hear you tell the part about the North Ridge," I said. Davis went still. "You didn't tell them that you wanted to go north," I continued. "You argued with me. You screamed into the radio that north was the only way out. North was clear," Davis snapped, defensive now. "North was a kill box." I corrected him. "I had a thermal lock on 3 snipers waiting on that ridge. If you had followed your gut, you would be dead." The room was deadly quiet. The guests looked back and forth between us. "I don't know how you know that," Davis stammered, his face flushing red. "Maybe you heard the tapes. Maybe you were listening in the comms room. That doesn't mean anything." He stood up, trying to regain his height, his dominance. "You weren't there, Rachel. You don't know what it felt like. You don't know what it's like to be responsible for 6 men when you think you're about to die." He pointed a finger at me. "You don't know the fear." I looked at him. I looked at the finger pointing at me. and I decided to end it. I know your heart rate was 174, I said softly. Davis's hand dropped. What? Your biometric monitor, I said. I was tracking it on my second screen. It hit 174 when the rocks started falling. I leaned forward. And I know what you whispered. Davis went pale. He looked terrified. For the first time, the hero looked like a frightened boy. Don't, he whispered. But I did. At 0200 hours, pinned down behind the shale, I said, my voice gentle but relentless. You keyed your mic. You didn't mean to broadcast it. But you did. I looked him in the eye. You said, please God, I can't do this. I want to go home. The silence in the room was suffocating. The bride put her hand over her mouth. The uncle looked at his plate. Davis slumped back into his chair. It was as if I had cut his strings. That wasn't in any report. That wasn't in any log. That was a secret between a man and his maker, and the operator listening in the dark. And do you remember what I said back? I asked. Davis looked up at me. His eyes were wet. He looked at me with recognition, with shock, and with memory flooding back. You said, his voice cracked. You said, breathe, Captain. I have eyes on you. I won't let you fall. Move left. I nodded, and you moved left. I sat back in my chair. I didn't panic, Mark. My voice didn't pitch up. I didn't freeze. I held you together when you were falling apart. I gestured to the piece of metal in his hand. And that drone? I didn't lose it. I crashed it into the fuel drums on the east sector to draw their fire so you could run. I took a sip of my water. So you can keep the souvenir. But don't you dare sit there and tell these people that support staff don't save lives. The silence stretched on for what felt like an hour. Davis looked at the metal fragment in his hand. He looked at it like it was a foreign object. He stood up slowly. His hands were shaking. He walked around the table. He didn't look at his fiancée. He didn't look at his friends. He walked straight to me. He placed the blackened piece of metal on the table in front of me. It was you. He whispered. You were Angel. You were Angel. That was my call sign, I said. He swallowed hard. I thought you were a man, I finished for him. A hero? He looked down. I'm sorry. I don't need your apology, Mark, I said. I just need you to tell the truth. He nodded. He looked at the room. She saved us, Davis said, his voice hoarse. I froze. I wanted to give up. She's the reason I'm standing here. He looked back at me. Thank you. I picked up the piece of metal. It was cold and heavy. It felt like closure. I stood up. Enjoy the wedding, I said. I turned and walked out of the room. No one spoke. No one stopped me. I walked out into the cool night air. The wind off the mountains slapped the back of my neck. But this time, it didn't feel cold. It felt fresh. I walked to my car. I didn't look back at the chapel. I didn't need to. I had spent years wondering if I mattered, wondering if my service counted if no one saw it. But as I held the broken piece of my drone, I realized I had the answer all along. The hero isn't the one who tells the best story. The hero is the one who does the work when the lights go out. I unlocked my car. I tossed the metal onto the passenger seat. It was time to go home. And for the first time in a long time, I liked the sound of my own voice.